My grandmother was not a woman who left things to Providence. She had been married at 17 to a man she chose herself, which was not, in 1803, a simple feat, and widowed at 49. She had run the Blackmere estate through 2 bad harvests and 1 particularly grim parliamentary season without anyone's assistance, and she had done so with a methodical composure that the estate manager privately called terrifying and publicly called a privilege. She played the pianoforte brilliantly, could quote Voltaire in the original, and had the ability to read a room in the time it took most people to find a seat in it. She was, in short, not someone who stood quietly by while life arranged itself poorly. I am Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Blackmere's younger brother. I was 26 that autumn, and I tell you now at my nephew's christening, with a glass of excellent claret in my hand, and my sister-in-law laughing across the room at something the vicar has just said, that I watched the whole affair unfold in real time and still did not understand it until it was nearly finished. That is how good my grandmother was. My brother Adrian had been the Duke of Blackmere for 7 years by the time any of this happened. He had come to the title at 24 when our father died of a sudden fever, married his first wife at 26, a gentle woman named Miriam, whom we all adored without reservation, and buried her and the child together before his 28th birthday. He had then retired, as thoroughly as a man with a large estate, 2 villages, and a seat in the House of Lords can retire, to Blackmere Park in the northern part of the county. He managed his land with a thoroughness that the tenant farmers respected. He attended Parliament when attendance was unavoidable, and left London the moment the session allowed. He read extensively. He discouraged visitors by the simple mechanism of being. When visitors arrived, so entirely courteous and so completely unreachable that most people found themselves, after 2 or 3 such visits, unconsciously scheduling things elsewhere. He was not, I should say, a cruel man. He had never been. He was not a cold man precisely, though people called him that. He was a man who had taken something enormous inside himself, the grief, the loss, the specific weight of Miriam's absence and the child who never drew breath, and built a very high wall around it, and who had decided with the quiet thoroughness that characterized everything he did that the wall was a permanent and sensible arrangement. He was 31. He seemed considerably older. When people spoke of the Duke of Blackmere in London drawing rooms, the words most commonly used were formidable and remote. Women had tried in the years since Miriam because he was a duke, and he was not yet 40, and he had a face that, when it was not managed into the expression he generally wore in company, was rather arresting. They were received with impeccable courtesy, offered tea at the correct interval, and got exactly nowhere. My grandmother watched 3 years of this with an expression I now recognize in retrospect as strategic patience. She said nothing. She offered no candidates. She attended to her own affairs, the dower house, her correspondence, her annual visits to Bath for the waters, which she held in moderate contempt but acknowledged as socially useful. The 4th year, in October, she went to a country assembly in Aldenvale. This was remarkable in itself. The Dowager Duchess of Blackmere did not attend country assemblies. She attended the events she had decided were worth attending and dismissed the rest with a brevity that could remove paint from furniture. When I heard that she had driven 12 miles on a cold October evening to a subscription dance held above the market hall in the town of Aldenvale, I understood that something was happening. I did not yet know what. She wrote me a letter the following week. It said only in her small, immaculate hand, "I have found someone interesting. Come to Blackmere in a fortnight and I will tell you about it." I came in a fortnight. I had no particular reason to be elsewhere, and when my grandmother summoned me to Blackmere, I had long since learned that the summons was worth answering. She met me in the green sitting room on a Wednesday afternoon, poured the tea herself. She sent the footman away when she wanted to talk seriously, and said without preamble, "I am going to tell you about Miss Cecily Vane." I did not know the name. I said so. "You wouldn't," said my grandmother, with the faint satisfaction she reserved for knowing things others did not. "Her father is Mr. Aldous Vane of Vane Hall, a small property 3 miles from Aldenvale, currently mortgaged past what is comfortable but not past what is manageable if managed carefully. There are 2 daughters. The elder, Miss Arabella Vane, was launched into the London season 2 years ago and made a creditable match with a baronet's son in Hertfordshire. She is gone. The younger is Miss Cecily, who was kept at Vane Hall because someone had to manage the household accounts and the linen and the kitchen garden. And it was not going to be Mr. Vane, who is a pleasant man and an inadequate one. How old is she? 23. She was at the Aldenvale Assembly in a dark green dress that had been carefully altered at the waist and was not quite new. She danced twice, once with her father's solicitor, once with a young farmer from the eastern end of the county who stepped on her feet during the second figure, and apologized so excessively that she spent more of the dance reassuring him than dancing. After that, she retired to the chairs along the east wall and spent the remainder of the evening reading the program. My grandmother set down her cup. There is very little of interest in a subscription assembly program, Edmund. I know because I looked at mine. Hers was apparently captivating. Or she was bored and preferred not to show it. Which is itself interesting. My grandmother's hands folded in her lap with the precision she brought to everything. I looked at her from across the room. She noticed. Most young women of her situation, noticed by a dowager duchess at a country assembly, respond in one of three ways. They look away immediately, or they compose themselves and attempt to appear unnoticed, or they do something foolish with their face in the direction of hopefulness. She did none of these. She looked back at me with perfect composure for approximately 3 seconds, and then returned her attention to the program. When I crossed the room and introduced myself, she rose, curtsied correctly, and greeted me without the slightest flutter of agitation or particular eagerness. She was simply present. I waited. I spoke with her for 20 minutes, said my grandmother. She is well-read, she has an accurate and unsentimental mind, and she has no particular illusions about her own situation. She told me when I inquired after her family that her father was a man of good character and modest capacity, that her sister had done very well, and that she herself had learned to be useful, which was perhaps less romantic but considerably more practical. She said this without bitterness and without performance. It was simply the accurate account. A pause. She is not what one would call a beauty. She is something better than that, though I recognize this is not a majority view among the people who make these assessments. Grandmother, I said, setting down my own cup, what are you intending? I'm going to invite her to Blackmere as my companion for the winter months, she said, in the tone of someone reading from a plan they have already completed. I shall say I am in need of a sensible young woman with good reading and pleasant company, and this will be entirely true. I have been finding my winters rather long of late, and Miss Vane is genuinely good company. The rest will take care of itself. The rest, I said. Meaning Adrian. Your brother, said my grandmother with a patience that was itself a kind of commentary on my density, has been walled up in that library for 3 years. He is 31 years old and he is turning himself into an institution. I will not stand by and watch it. He needs someone to be in a room with. Not a candidate, not a project, not another woman delivered to his door on the mechanism of family expectation. Someone who will simply be in the room, who wants nothing from him, who is not performing anything, and who will, if I have made a correct assessment, interest him. I thought about arguing. My grandmother's expression suggested this would be an investment with no return. What if he is immune? I said instead. What if he ignores her for 4 months, and she goes home, and nothing happens? Then she will have had a comfortable winter and an excellent reference, said my grandmother. But I don't think he will ignore her. She is not the sort of woman men ignore once they have actually looked at her. The difficulty with Cecily Vane is that in her current situation, most men have not troubled to look. She doesn't demand it. She is simply there, and most people walk past simply there and notice striking and forward and eager and miss the thing that is worth noticing. She looked at me steadily. Adrian has been surrounded for 3 years by people who want things from him, his time, his influence, his title, his presence at events he finds tedious. She will want nothing. That will unsettle him. I am counting on it. She was right as it turned out. She was irritatingly right, as she generally was. The invitation was sent. The letter of acceptance came back promptly, written in a small, extremely legible hand with no excess of gratitude. Miss Cecily Vane arrived at Blackmere Park on the first Saturday of November, in a hired carriage from Aldenvale, with a single trunk and a small leather case of books. I had arranged to be there. I told Adrian I was passing through to visit a friend in the next county, which was, if one were generous with geography, roughly true, and he received this information with the mild and resigned suspicion he directed at most of my explanations, offered me a room, and went back to his papers. I was in the entrance hall when her carriage came through the gate. She stepped out with the competent ease of someone accustomed to managing her own arrival. looked up at Blackmere Park's facade with an expression that I can only describe as assessing, not intimidated, not impressed in any performing way, simply taking in the information of the building with interest, and then turned to thank the groom who was lifting down her trunk with a directness and simplicity that made him blink, and then, after a beat, smile. She was not what I had assembled from my grandmother's description. I had expected someone compelling in a way I could easily name. She was something else. Middle height, dark hair pinned simply, a face that was thoughtful rather than immediately striking, the kind of face that was very still when nothing had caught its attention and very alive when something had. Her traveling dress was brown, carefully maintained, and not new. She moved with a kind of unemphatic certainty, as though she had an accurate understanding of how much space she occupied and was comfortable with it. My grandmother descended, and they greeted each other with a warmth that suggested the fortnight's correspondence had established more than an arrangement. "And this is my younger grandson, Mr. Edmund Ashford," my grandmother said. "He is passing through." "On his way to somewhere convincingly far away, I expect," said Cecily Vane. Her voice was low, even without any particular edge in it. It was an observation rather than a joke, and it was accurate, and something in my grandmother's posture became a degree more satisfied without moving at all. Adrian appeared in the doorway of his study at the sound of voices. I don't think he had come to greet anyone. It was reflex, the involuntary check of a man who has been very quiet in a large house for 3 years and registers the sound of more voices than usual. He stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, a letter in one hand, and looked at Miss Vane with the expression of a man determining what he is looking at. She did not curtsy immediately. She finished her sentence, something about the road from Aldenvale, which had been badly kept and would, she thought, require attention before the winter, and then turned, found him, and curtsied neatly. "Your Grace." He said, "Miss Vane," in a tone that committed to nothing and gave nothing away. She nodded, which was exactly the correct response to that tone, and turned back to follow my grandmother up the stairs. Adrian remained in the doorway for a moment. He looked at the place where she had been standing. Then he looked at me. "I was not informed of a companion," he said. "You were," I said pleasantly. "My grandmother's letter 3 weeks ago. You signed the letter of welcome yourself. I was here when she drafted it." A pause. "She is younger than I expected," he said. "Is she?" I said. "Would you like some claret? I find I want some claret." I went to find the claret and left him standing in his doorway. The first 2 weeks were, by outward appearance, entirely unremarkable. My grandmother read in the mornings, dictated correspondence to Cecily in the late morning, received 2 callers who had heard she was in residence and wished to pay their respects, and was served by Cecily throughout with an efficiency that was something other than servitude. It looked, in fact, rather like partnership, though a quiet one. Cecily went to the village twice, wrote 2 letters to her father, mended something in the linen room that the housekeeper had been unable to address for a week, and was found by the head footman one afternoon very carefully recataloguing the wines in the cellar, which had been organized inaccurately for 6 years, with the cellar's permission and evident gratitude. She was, in short, a person who saw what needed doing, and did it without requiring an audience. Adrian ignored her with a consistency that might have looked deliberate if one were watching for it. He said good morning in the corridor twice, moved on both times, and declined my grandmother's invitation to dine with the family on the Wednesday of the first week, citing correspondence. He dined with us on the Thursday. He sat at one end of the table with his estate manager's quarterly report beside his plate, a habit my grandmother disliked and had never entirely stamped out, and addressed Cecily across the table once, to ask whether she took wine. She said she would take a little, "Thank you, Your Grace," with the same composure she brought to everything. He poured it, he returned to the report. She talked to me about the road conditions between Aldenvale and the estate for a quarter of an hour, then talked to my grandmother about a history of the county she had found on the library shelves, and said nothing further to Adrian, who did not look up from his report again, which I noticed, and which my grandmother noticed, and which Cecily either did not notice or chose not to address. The third collision was in the library. I was there, which was not an accident. I had a talent developed young for being present in rooms at convenient moments. I was reading in the far corner when Cecily came in at 3:30 in the afternoon, confirmed the room was empty or nearly empty, She glanced at me briefly and clearly assessed me as sufficiently unimportant to the afternoon, and went to the shelves on the east wall. She found what she was looking for in a few minutes, a large volume on the agricultural reforms of the previous century, which she carried to the window seat and opened. Adrian came in at 4:30. He came in the way he always entered his library, with purpose, going directly to his desk, and stopped when he saw her. She looked up. "I asked your grandmother whether I might use the library," she said. "She said the collection was for use by the household. I hope that was correct." He looked at her, a pause that was not quite awkward. He did not do awkward, but was more uncertain than he usually permitted himself. "It was," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to her book. He went to his desk. He sat. He opened his correspondence. He read 3 letters and drafted responses to 2 of them. In the 35 minutes that followed, I watched from my corner my brother look up from his correspondence 6 times. Not at the window, not at the fire. At Cecily Vane, who was reading about the enclosure movement with the same quality of attention she brought to the wine cellar and the linen room. She did not look up at all during those 35 minutes. When he finally rose to leave, he paused at the door and said, without turning, "The volume you have is the 2nd edition. The 3rd edition, which corrects several errors in the tables, is on the lower shelf, 4th section from the left, 3rd shelf down." A silence, then Cecily, "Thank you." He left. She looked at the door for a moment. Then she got up, found the 3rd edition on the lower shelf, exactly where he had said, compared it to the open page, made a small sound of acknowledgement, and traded one for the other. My grandmother, when I reported this at dinner, made no comment. Her expression made the comment for her. He came back to the library on the Thursday. She was there again. On Friday, she was not there when he arrived, and he stayed for an hour and 40 minutes rather than the usual 40 and produced, I was told by the footman who carried them, a markedly smaller amount of outgoing correspondence than usual. The following Monday, the catalogue entry for the Aldenmere correspondence collection, a set of letters from the 3rd Duke, badly shelved and worse logged, had a new note in the margin. Adrian found it on Tuesday morning. The note was in Cecily's small, extremely legible hand and said, "3rd Duke's drainage method partially unsuccessful. Failure documented in estate records 1791-1794. Correction implemented by 4th Duke, 1799. See Estate Ledger Vol. 14 pp. 112-117. This correction is not reflected in the current catalogue entry and should be." Adrian came to breakfast on Tuesday looking like a man who had spent the previous evening in the estate ledgers. He said to Cecily across the table, "You found the Aldenmere correspondence." She said, "I saw it was miscatalogued." "I catalogued that collection at 19, he said. A slight pause. She looked at him with the directness that was simply her characteristic mode. "Then you were 19, she said. "The ledgers were available. I had time." He looked at her for a moment. "The correction was right," he said. "The drainage method or my note?" "Both." She nodded and returned to her toast. He had not, I realized, said this to dismiss the observation or to manage it. He had said it because it was true, and he was a person who said what was true. She had received it the same way. It was, between 2 people who were not yet friends, the most efficient conversation I had ever witnessed. The 4th week of November brought a letter from Aldenvale that changed things. I had been in London for 10 days. My initial excuse for being at Blackmere had collapsed under its own implausibility, when a letter arrived from my grandmother asking me to return. I came back to find the house in a state of invisible tension that resolved itself over breakfast the following morning when my grandmother told me what had happened. Cecily's father had written. The situation was, his largest creditor, a merchant from the city with more patience than most but less than infinite, had grown tired of waiting for a sum outstanding on the Lowerfield mortgage at Vane Hall. The sum was not enormous. It was, however, urgent. Mr. Vane had been managing the Vane Hall finances with a combination of optimism and string for 2 years, and both had run out. He wrote to Cecily asking whether, with discretion, she might inquire of the Dowager Duchess whether there was any position of permanent employment she might recommend. A governess with a good family, perhaps, or a permanent companion situation with income attached. Because his arrangement with the Dowager, in which Cecily's presence at Blackmere came with a modest household allowance, could not in conscience be accepted indefinitely by a man who still had his pride, even if not much else. It was, in short, the kind of letter that a man writes when he has no other options and writes badly. "She showed me the letter," said my grandmother. "She came to me directly, which is entirely in character. She said, 'I wanted you to know the situation because I don't want there to be misunderstanding. I have no income. My father needs one before the spring. If there is a position you know of, I would be grateful for the recommendation. If there isn't, I should begin making my own inquiries, and I wanted to give you time to make other arrangements for your winter.'" "She gave you the chance to replace her," I said. "She gave me the honest accounting of her situation and asked for nothing but information." My grandmother set down her cup. "She is the most forthright young woman I have encountered in 30 years of dealing with people who are not." I said, "What did you tell her?" "I told her I would think about it," said my grandmother, "which was true because I have been thinking about nothing else since. And then I wrote to you because this has become a situation that is beyond unilateral management. I need you to tell Adrian." I understood her. If she told him the Dowager Duchess, his grandmother who had engineered this arrangement, he would see the management in it and resist it. If Cecily told him herself, it would have a character that was not the right one. If I told him, as his brother, plainly, it would be the most honest possible delivery. I found Adrian in the stables that afternoon. He had come in from a ride and was consulting with his head groom about a mare whose off-fore had gone soft on the stones of the north lane. I waited until they had finished and said, "Walk with me." He walked. I told him in straightforward terms what the situation was: the Vane family's finances, the creditor, the sum, Cecily's position, her father's letter. I did not present it as an opportunity. I presented it as a fact. Adrian did not respond well to being managed, and I had long since stopped trying. He listened without comment. We walked the length of the kitchen garden wall and the beginning of the orchard before he spoke. "How much?" he said. I gave him the figure. He was quiet for another 30 yards. The bare trees of the orchard were overhead, the ground soft from yesterday's rain, the light at that late-autumn angle that made everything look both vivid and elegiac at once. In summer the orchard was one of the finest things about Blackmere, the old apple trees dense and heavy, the grass underneath long and bright. In November it was stripped bare and luminous, the trunks dark against the pale sky, and there was something about it that I had always felt, growing up, was the truest version of the place. Adrian had always preferred the orchard in winter. He had said once when he was very young that you could see the shape of the trees in winter in a way you could not in summer, when the leaves covered everything. I had not thought of that in years. I thought of it now. "She will find a situation," he said, "if she needs to." "Yes," I said. "She will find a situation. She is not without resources. She is good at managing what she has." A longer silence. The path wound between the trees and came out at a stile at the far end of the orchard, with a view across the lower fields to the line of elms that marked the boundary of the estate. Adrian stopped at the stile and stood looking at the fields. "She left a note in the Aldenmere catalogue," he said, "about the drainage, the fourth Duke's correction in 1799. "I know," I said. "You mentioned it at breakfast." "I went back to the ledgers after I found it," he said, "to verify what she'd said. I hadn't intended to spend the afternoon in the ledger room. I had estate accounts to review, but I went. The ledger entry for 1799 is in my grandfather's hand. He annotated it. He wrote in the margin, 'This correction resolves the water problem in the lower east field in a manner that I ought to have implemented 30 years ago and did not, owing to an error in my initial survey which I should have recognized sooner.' I had never read that annotation. In 7 years of running this estate, going through those ledgers every spring, I had never read that particular page. I waited. 'She found it,' he said, 'from a catalog note that was incorrectly shelved in 2 hours on a Wednesday afternoon in a library she had been given access to 4 days before.' He turned from the stile and looked at me. 'What does she want, Edmund? I mean in general, from this arrangement?' 'From being here.' 'I don't think she wants anything specific,' I said. 'Not from you. A reference, ultimately, and a permanent situation. From her time here, I think, the books, the comfortable winter, my grandmother's company. She is not here with an agenda.' 'No,' he said, 'she is not.' He looked back at the fields. 'She has been here for 3 weeks. She has reordered the wine cellar, corrected a 6-year error in the household accounts that my housekeeper had been carrying forward as a rounding matter, found a drainage problem in the archive that I had not found in 7 years, and she has done none of this in a way that announced itself or required acknowledgement. He stopped. She simply does what needs doing and moves on to the next thing. Yes, I said. She is not performing, he said. No, I said. He was quiet for a long moment. The fields lay flat and gray-green under the November sky, the elm line very still. A rook crossed from one tree to another at the far edge of the view, unhurried. My household, said Adrian, has been full for 3 years of people performing their sympathy, performing their efficiency, performing their patience with a man who is difficult company and who they are managing. I have been aware of this. It has not, I think, made me better company. He turned from the stile. She is not managing me. She has no interest in managing me. She is simply there. He walked back toward the house. I walked with him. Neither of us said anything else on the subject. The following morning, a letter left Blackmere by the early post. I did not ask what it said or where it was going. It was not my business to ask. 3 days later, Cecily received a letter from her father's solicitor. The outstanding debt on the Lowerfield mortgage at Vane Hall had been settled in full by an anonymous party who had contacted the solicitor's office directly and paid in cash. The solicitor was, the letter said, considerably surprised, and wished to assure Mr. Vane that the transaction was entirely in order and that the note was discharged. Cecily read this at the breakfast table. She sat very still with the letter in her hand for a moment that lasted perhaps 5 seconds, and in those 5 seconds something moved through her face that was not the expression she generally wore, not the composed, even quality that was her default, but something beneath it, unguarded and brief. Then she folded the letter precisely. My grandmother was reading her own correspondence. I was making a project of the marmalade. Neither of us had anything to say. Cecily said, "Excuse me," and rose. She went, not upstairs, but toward the study. I looked at my grandmother over the marmalade. She looked back at me with the composure of a general who has just heard, from a distance, that the engagement is going as planned. I could not, from the breakfast room, hear what passed in the study. I finished my breakfast. After 20 minutes I excused myself from the table and went, under the pretense of needing something from my room, along the corridor. The study door was not quite fully closed. I am not proud of what followed. I have told myself since that I had a fraternal interest in my brother's welfare, and that this constituted a legitimate reason to position myself at an angle to a slightly ajar door. I stand by this reasoning less firmly every time I revisit it. What I heard was this. First, a silence of perhaps 15 seconds, not empty but weighted, the quality of a room in which something has just been said that cannot be unsaid. Then Cecily's voice, low and precise. "It was you." A pause. Then Adrian, not a statement but as plain acknowledgement. "Yes." Another silence, longer. Then Cecily, "I came to tell you that I know because I thought you ought to know that I know, and because I am not," a pause. "I am not comfortable with the alternative, which is to receive a kindness from someone and not acknowledge it, even if the acknowledgement is difficult." Her voice had a quality I had not heard from her before, not unsteady, but stripped of its usual evenness. She was working to keep it even. "I am not in the habit of having other people make decisions about my family's affairs without consulting me, or without my knowledge." "No," said Adrian, "I should not have imagined you would be." A pause. "It was the kindest thing," she said. "That has been done for my family in 4 years. My father has been, it has been very difficult for a long time, and what you did it has released him from something. I saw it in the letter." A pause. "I don't know how to hold that alongside the other part, the part where you decided something about my family's circumstances without telling me." "I should have told you," he said. "I know that. I did not tell you because I thought you might refuse, or that it would become a thing between us that made everything." He stopped. "I did not want it to become a thing between us." "It is a thing between us," she said, "however you intended it." "Yes," he said, "I know." A pause. Something in his voice changed in a way I had not heard in 3 years, not unmanaged precisely, but different. Quieter. The word I want is plain. He was being plain in a way he had not been in 3 years, and the plainness had a quality of not being comfortable with itself yet, of being unpracticed. "Miss Vane, Cecily." Her first name, not as a form of address, but as what she was. "I am not going to tell you that I had no interest in the matter beyond the abstract injustice of it." You are a precise person and you would know that was false. I addressed the situation because it was unjust. But I also, he stopped, started again. I also addressed it because the thought of your circumstances changing, the thought of your leaving Blackmere. I found a pause that was longer than his pauses usually were. I did not want you to leave. A silence very long. Then Cecily, I had no plans to leave until March. And Adrian, after a moment, I know I meant after March. I removed myself from the corridor and went to the east sitting room and sat down and looked out the window at the winter garden for a considerable length of time. Cecily came back through the breakfast room later that morning and went upstairs without speaking to anyone. Her face had the quality it sometimes had when something had caught her attention, alive and very still at once. I found Adrian in his study that afternoon. He was standing at the window, which he had done before in similar circumstances, but this time he did not look like a man waiting for something to pass. He looked like a man who had done something he had not known he was going to do until he did it, and was in the process of taking its measure. She knew, he said when I came in. From the moment she read the solicitor's letter, she said afterward that anonymous benefactors were not common in her experience and that the timing was not ambiguous. A pause. She was not angry exactly. She said the word unjust was hers, that she had been thinking it about her father's situation for 2 years and had not said it aloud to anyone. What else did she say? I said. She said she was going to need time to work out how to respond to it correctly. He looked out the window. She said, I will need to think. I said, take whatever time you need. She said, I don't know how long that will be. I said, I know. His voice was quiet and without performance. I told her I didn't want her to leave after March. You told her that? I told her that, he said. Yes, a pause. I have not said anything like that to anyone in 3 years. I find that I am not sorry. He turned from the window. There was something in his face that I had not seen there in a long time, not happiness precisely, not yet, but something that was the space where happiness might eventually arrive. A kind of tentative availability. A man who has opened a window he had nailed shut some time ago and is standing at it, unsure yet what the air outside will feel like, but willing to find out. Edmund, he said, what has grandmother done? I have no idea what you mean, I said. I am passing through. He gave me the flattest look in his considerable arsenal. Then, quietly, the corner of his mouth moved in a way it had not in 3 years, and he went back to his desk. December arrived and brought with it hard frost, the smell of wood fires in every room of Blackmere Park, and a change in the house that was almost invisible unless one was, as I had by this point permanently become, watching for it. Adrian came to dinner without being summoned. This had not been happening in October. He asked Cecily, one evening in the first week of December, what she was reading, and the question led to a conversation that lasted 45 minutes and covered the history of cartography from the 16th century through its role in the Napoleonic campaigns, the question of whether maps change wars or whether wars change maps, and a disagreement about the particular campaign in Spain that Cecily argued from a book she had found on the second-floor landing and Adrian argued from memory, and they were, in my assessment as a disinterested observer, equally right, which I did not say because the disagreement was clearly enjoyable and it was not my place to stop it. My grandmother sat through this with her eyes half closed, and the expression of a woman listening to music she had waited a long time to hear. The following Saturday morning I was inspecting the dormant rose bushes in the east garden, a task I invented on the spot, and which I will not pretend was convincing. When I looked through the library window, and found that at some point in the morning Cecily and Adrian had moved from sitting across the table from each other to sitting beside each other over the Aldenmere correspondence, their heads both at the same angle. His finger tracing a line in the letter, while her hand lay flat on the page beside it, neither of them appearing to have noticed any of this had happened. I went back to the roses. I have no idea what I was supposed to be doing with the roses. I stood there for a quarter of an hour, and then my grandmother came around the corner with her walking stick and stood beside me, and we both looked in at the library window together. He's not building the wall, I said. No, she said. I haven't seen him not build the wall in 3 years. I know, she said. She walked back toward the kitchen garden. She did not appear to find any of this remarkable. She appeared to find it inevitable, which is a different thing. There was an evening in the middle of December that I come back to more than any other. We had been four at dinner, my grandmother, Adrian, Cecily, and myself. And afterward the evening had done something unusual, which was that it had not ended. Normally Adrian retreated to his study by 9. Normally my grandmother retired with a book at 10. That evening somehow none of this happened. The fire was good. My grandmother asked Cecily to read something. Cecily had found, on a top shelf in the library, a collection of letters that had belonged to our great-aunt, a woman of formidable opinions and brilliant cruelty who had died before either Adrian or I was born, but who had left, in her letters, the record of an extraordinarily vivid personality. Sharp letters. Funny ones. Letters about people she had known with a specificity that was devastating and delightful in equal measure. Cecily read for half an hour. My grandmother interjected with corrections. She had known the great-aunt in the last 10 years of her life and could update the record on several points. And the corrections were themselves funnier and sharper than the letters. I laughed. My grandmother did not quite laugh, but made the sound she made when something amused her, which was almost indistinguishable from amusement to anyone who knew her, and Cecily read on. Adrian sat in the chair nearest the fire throughout. He had his long legs extended, and his head resting in his hand and his eyes, for the whole of the half-hour and beyond it, on Cecily's face. I noticed this because I was watching him. He was watching her the way you watch something that you are trying to understand, not cataloging her, not performing any kind of observation, simply looking at her with the quality of attention he brought to things he found significant. Cecily looked up occasionally from the letters. When she did, she would check the room briefly, the fire, my grandmother, me. And then once or twice her eyes came to Adrian, and he met them without looking away. She held that for half a second, and then went back to the page. He did not look away. He just continued watching her face. This went on for 2 hours. The evening ended without anyone quite deciding it had. My grandmother rose eventually and said she was going to bed, which was the signal, and Cecily set down the letters and said good night, and Adrian said good night, and they all went upstairs in different directions. I found my grandmother in the corridor outside the sitting room and said, very quietly, "He's falling in love with her." "Yes," she said, equally quietly. "He has been for some weeks." "You could see it from the library," I said, "from the first time he came in and found her." "The catalog note," she said. "When he came to me the next day asking very carefully who had recommended Miss Vane for her position, he had the expression of a man assembling information for a purpose he hadn't named yet, even to himself." She paused at the top of the stairs. "He never chose before. His choices have always been made for him, the title, the estate, even Miriam, whom he loved genuinely but did not choose in the way a man chooses when he has a clear-eyed understanding of what he wants. He is learning that. I think it will take a little longer, but he is learning." I thought about this in bed that night for a long time. Christmas came and brought with it Cecily's father's annual letter, better than the earlier one, written with the lightened quality of a man from whom a weight has been removed. He was doing well. The lower fields were improved. The tenant for the north cottage had paid his arrears. He wished his daughter a peaceful Christmas and sent his regards to the Dowager Duchess and her family. Cecily read this at the breakfast table with a quiet brightness that had nothing performing in it, simply the uncomplicated pleasure of good news about someone she loved. She folded the letter and said, "My father sounds better." Adrian, from behind the estate report he had brought to breakfast, my grandmother was waging a long and gradual campaign against this practice, said, "I'm glad." A pause, Cecily said, "Are you?" It was not quite a question. He put down the estate report and looked at her across the table. The report had never been put down before. My grandmother did not look up from her correspondence. "Miss Vane," he said, with the deliberateness of a man who has been composing a sentence for some time, "I should like to ask you something." Cecily waited, with the patience she brought to all things. "I should like to know," he said, "whether you are comfortable here, whether the arrangement has been, whether it has suited you." He stopped. "And whether you intend to remain." She looked at him steadily. "My engagement runs until March," she said. "That was the arrangement." "I know what the arrangement was," he said. Silence, the fire went in and out. "Are you asking whether I want to remain past March?" she said. "I am asking," he said, "whether you would consider it, in whatever arrangement might be, in whatever capacity." He stopped again. Something in his expression shifted, the managed quality giving way to something simpler and less practiced. I would like you to stay. She looked at her hands, then at him. I would want to understand, she said very quietly, what I was staying as. He stood. It was not a considered movement. He stood the way a man stands when something inside him refuses to remain seated any longer. He crossed to the window and stood there with his back to the room, his hands behind him, and I thought, he is going to retreat. He is going to take this moment and put it behind the wall with everything else. He turned around. I am not going to be elegant about this, he said. I am capable of elegance in most things, but not in this because I have not enough practice, and this matters too much to get wrong by being elegant. He looked at her. I am not easy. I am not uncomplicated. I have been for 3 years very deliberately alone, and I had persuaded myself this was a reasonable state of affairs. It was not unreasonable. I had experienced a loss, and I had decided, for reasons that seemed sound at the time, that I was not going to recover from it in a way that left me fit company for anyone, and so the sensible response was to be alone. He paused. You are the reason that persuasion has stopped working. You came here and you catalogued the drainage, and you read to my grandmother in the evenings, and you argued with me about the Spanish campaign, and I found that I was, he stopped. I found that I was keeping track of where in the house you were. I found myself going to the library for reasons I could not account for. I found that the evenings were not the same on the nights you were not at dinner, and that the evenings were, he looked away briefly at the wall, then back at her. They were different. A very long silence. My grandmother's pen had been still since he stood up. I am not proposing to you this morning, he said. I want to be clear about that. I am asking whether you would give me the time to learn to do this correctly, whatever this is. I am asking whether you would stay past March in some capacity that is to be determined and give me the time to, he stopped, looked at her, to determine it. Cecily had not moved. Her face had the quality it sometimes had, very still, very present, the attention entirely forward, but beneath it was something else, something that was not quite still. You said, she said carefully, when we spoke in the study that you did not want me to leave after March. Yes, he said. You did not explain that further. No. I have been, she looked at her hands. I have been for 2 months in your house, reading your family's letters and arguing with you about maps and sitting in your library and thinking. She stopped. I have been thinking that this is not what I expected my life to look like, and that I don't know what to do with that. No, he said, neither do I. A silence. March, she said finally. I will stay until March. And in March, if you would like to ask me something, I will listen. He looked at her. The expression on his face was something I had not seen there in 3 years. The wall was not built. It was not absent. It was not as though the grief had not happened or that he was someone other than who he was. But it was not up. He was standing in the room simply with the window at his back and the fire going and Cecily Vane across the breakfast table, and the wall was not up. March, he said. March, she agreed. My grandmother's pen resumed. January arrived and February. The house at Blackmere Park, which had been a particular kind of quiet for 3 years, not peaceful exactly, but managed, the quiet of something contained, became a different kind of quiet. Easier. Warmer in a way that had nothing to do with the fires, which were the same fires as always, and everything to do with the fact that the 2 people in the house were no longer managing the distance between them, but navigating it, carefully, with care. They walked the grounds on the days the weather permitted. Not arranged walks, the kind that happened because one of them was going somewhere and the other fell into step, which was something Cecily had been doing with my grandmother and began, in January, to do with Adrian as well. He showed her the home farm. She asked sensible and specific questions about the rotation and the winter pasture management. She asked a question about the Lower East drainage that had the head farmer staring at her with the expression of a man who has just been asked, by a slight young woman in a winter coat, a question that 3 seasons of farmers' meetings had not produced, and then looking at Adrian with the expression that said, clearly, where did this one come from? He lent her books. She returned them with notes tucked inside the front cover, not annotations in the margins, which she seemed to sense would be a different kind of intrusion, but small folded pieces of paper with her observations. Agreements, sometimes, or acknowledgments of a point well made. Corrections, twice, politely stated and accurate. Once a long disagreement about a footnote that ran to a page and a half, and had him in his study for 2 hours composing a rebuttal. and then another hour on the rebuttal to the rebuttal, and appearing at dinner in the expression of a man who has had a thoroughly satisfying afternoon and is not going to explain why. She knew he was writing rebuttals. She received each folded note with a composure that I eventually identified as suppressed amusement, and the composure held until one evening in the second week of February when he handed her back a volume with a particularly long note in it. A note that apparently addressed her long disagreement with a specificity she had not anticipated, and she opened it and read it and laughed. An actual laugh, brief and low and real, and she looked up at him over the volume and said, "You checked the French edition." "Of course I checked the French edition," he said. She looked at him for a moment with that expression, very still, very present, and then said, "You are a very unreasonable man to argue with." "I am a very accurate man to argue with," he said, "which is different." "It is not," she said, "different in the way you think it is." And they argued this point for 20 minutes over after dinner. Claret and my grandmother sat in her chair with her embroidery, and did not quite smile, which was as close to smiling as she generally got. There was an afternoon in the third week of January that I have returned to since because it seems to me, in retrospect, the clearest single image of what was happening between them, stripped of any of the words around it. I had been in the village on estate business and came back through the kitchen garden in the late afternoon, when the light was going early the way it does in January, and the air had that particular cold quality that sits on the back of the throat. As I came through the gate, I saw them at the far end of the garden path, not walking, stopped, standing beside the low wall that separates the kitchen garden from the orchard, both of them looking at something on the ground. I stopped where I was. They had not seen me. What they were looking at, I realized, as I got a little closer without announcing myself, was a very small patch of snowdrops that had come up early in the shelter of the wall. They came up there every year. My mother had planted them the first year she came to Blackmere, and they had naturalized along the base of the wall and appeared every January without fail, white and precise, exactly there. Adrian knew them. He had known them all his life. He was saying something I could not quite hear. Cecily was listening, her head bent slightly toward him, not looking at the snowdrops but at him, listening in the particular way she had that was not passive but engaged, that brought her whole attention forward. He said something further, and she said something back, and he turned to look at her, and she looked up at him. And for a moment they were simply two people looking at each other in a winter garden in the late afternoon light with the snowdrops at their feet, and nothing arranged or performed about any of it. Then Cecily laughed, the brief, low, real laugh she had, and said something, and he said something, and they walked on. I went back through the kitchen garden gate and round the long way to the house. That evening at dinner Adrian said, across the table, that the snowdrops in the kitchen garden had come in early this year. He thought because of the sheltered position of the south wall. He said this to the table in general, which meant to all of us, but he was looking at Cecily when he said it. She said, "The south wall holds heat from the summer. My mother had a wall like that at Vane Hall for the early peas." A pause. "I have been thinking about the kitchen garden here. The rotation seems to favor the north beds, but the south beds have better light. I wondered whether the head gardener had considered moving the brassicas." My grandmother said, with perfect serenity, "I am sure he would welcome the observation." Adrian said, "I will speak to him." He did speak to him the following morning, and the head gardener, who had his own views about the kitchen garden and was not easily moved, came to find me afterward with the slightly dazed expression of a man who has just been told by his employer, very politely, that the young woman staying at the house had a thought about the brassica rotation, and that he, the head gardener, might consider it, and who is still determining how he feels about this. "Is she right?" I said. He thought about it. "Aye," he said, with the tone of a man extracting a tooth. "Probably." I told my grandmother. She did not quite smile, but the embroidery needle went in with more satisfaction than usual. The question of what was happening between them was not, in that house, in those months, something anyone pretended not to know. Blackmere Park is old, and the rooms connect, and the corridors carry sound, and the household, which had served the Ashford family for 30 years, had eyes. The housekeeper said nothing, but quietly arranged for the blue room on the east wing, which had been closed and unheated since the autumn, to be aired and freshened, for no reason she stated aloud. The head footman noticed that the Duke's morning ride now ended, on the days when the weather permitted, at the path beside the kitchen garden. which happened to be where Miss Vane walked in the mornings when she was not writing to her father. The estate manager, who had been with Adrian since before Miriam died, and who had watched the 3 years with a quiet grief of his own, reported to me one Tuesday that the Duke had been in the lower East Fields asking about the 4th Duke's drainage revision in some detail, and that he had brought a plan with him and several questions that suggested he had been thinking about it for some time. The estate manager found the interest slightly puzzling until it became clear the questions were not being asked in isolation. He told me this with the expression of a man trying not to appear moved and failing. "He's all right then," the estate manager said. "He will be," I said. "Good," said the estate manager, and went back to his accounts with the air of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told he can set it down. There was one other evening I want to record, though it was not dramatic. It was the last Sunday of February, cold and clear, the kind of February evening when the sky goes a very deep blue before dark and the stars come in sharp. My grandmother had retired early with a headache she described as minor, and then retreated from with the decisiveness that suggested it was not. I had been reading in the east sitting room and fell asleep, and when I woke it was past 9 and the fire had gone low and the room was dim. I went to find a footman to build it up and went the long way, through the corridor past the library, and through the half-open door I heard nothing. Not the voices from the evenings of the past months, not an argument about maps or a passage being read aloud. Simply the sound of 2 people in a room together who are not talking because they don't need to. Silence that is not empty but inhabited. The kind of silence that requires a certain kind of trust to make, and that once made is its own kind of thing. I did not stop. I went and found the footman and came back the short way and sat by the rebuilt fire and thought about that silence for a long time. I told my grandmother in the 2nd week of February that she had done something extraordinary. She said, "I have done nothing. I arranged for a sensible young woman to spend the winter here. The rest is theirs." "You went to the Aldenvale Assembly," I said. "You drove 12 miles in October to a country dance you have not attended in 9 years. You wrote to me. You told me to tell Adrian about the debt. You told me to come back." "The roads were better than usual," she said. I looked at her. She set down her embroidery. For a moment she looked, in the firelight, not quite like the Dowager Duchess, more like a woman who has been afraid of something, and is only now beginning to believe that the thing she was afraid of is not going to happen. "He was becoming someone I did not recognize," she said. "He was becoming the Duke of Blackmere in a way that had nothing of Adrian in it, the title without the man." She looked at the fire. "I was not going to watch that." March arrived on a Thursday. The daffodils in the kitchen garden were making the first fragile attempt, very yellow against the bare earth. On the Saturday of the 1st week of March, I was reading in the east sitting room. My grandmother was embroidering. The house had the quality of a place in which everyone is aware that something is about to happen, and nobody is acknowledging it. At 10:30, I heard footsteps in the corridor, Adrian's, which I knew, measured and without hurry, Cecily's, lighter, a half-step quicker than usual. Then the library door opened and closed. My grandmother looked up from her embroidery. She looked at me. I rose, on the pretext of needing something from the corridor, and went and stood outside the library door. 2 minutes of silence, then Cecily's voice clearly enough, "You said March." A pause, then Adrian, "Yes." Another pause, then, "You have been very patient." And Adrian quietly, "No, I have not been patient actually. I have decided every morning for 8 weeks not to walk into whatever room you were in and say it before you were ready. That is not patience. I don't know what it is." A silence longer. Then Cecily, "Then perhaps you should say it now." A long silence, long enough that I considered leaving. I did not leave. Then Adrian's voice, in a register I had not heard since the evening before Miriam's funeral, low and stripped of every managed quality, simply his voice, saying the true thing. "Miss Vane, Cecily, I want to marry you. I want to be honest with you about every element of that, including the parts that are not elegant. I am not an easy man. I am not uncomplicated. I have been alone for 3 years by deliberate choice, and I am still sometimes the man who built that particular wall. But I have spent 8 months in this house. 8 months, not 4. He had been counting from the beginning, I realized, from the assembly, from before she arrived. Finding out that there is a room I want to be in, and that the room is whichever one you are in. I want to argue with you about maps and French footnotes and agricultural drainage for the rest of my life. I want to sit across from you at breakfast when you read your father's letters and watch your face when the news is good. I want, he stopped, and when he continued his voice was quieter, I want to keep you near me. I said that in the study in November, and it was true, and it has only become more true, and I find I cannot manage it into something less than it is anymore. Will you marry me? Not a question, a plain statement. He wanted to marry her. A silence of perhaps 10 seconds, which felt considerably longer. Cecily, so quietly I barely caught it. Yes. And then a silence that was not empty. I went back to the east sitting room. I sat down, I opened my book, I did not read a word. After some time, my grandmother said, without looking up, "Well." "Yes," I said. She made one stitch and said nothing. He came to find us in the afternoon, not sending word ahead, simply appearing in the sitting room doorway with Cecily beside him, her hand on his arm, the contact quiet and certain and new. He looked as though the wall had not been knocked down so much as opened, still the Duke of Blackmere, still Adrian, but with something in his face available that had not been available in 3 years. "I intend to speak to Mr. Vane tomorrow," he said to my grandmother, "if the weather allows." "Of course," said my grandmother. Cecily looked at her. I had wondered in the months of watching what Cecily made of the arrangement, whether she had seen the management in it, whether she had resented it. The look she gave my grandmother was not simple, but it was not angry or cold. It was the direct look she gave everything, and in it was something that was gratitude without performance and recognition without accusation. It said plainly, "I know what you did. I am glad you did it." My grandmother received this with perfect composure. "I required a companion for the winter," she said. "It happens the arrangement suited everyone." Adrian looked at his grandmother with the expression of a man who has been assembling pieces for 8 months and has finally laid them correctly. "You went to the Aldenvale Assembly in October," he said. "I have been told you have not attended a country assembly in 9 years. "The roads were better this year," she said. "Grandmother's." She looked up at him. The composure held, but beneath it was the thing I had seen in the firelight, a woman who had been afraid and was no longer afraid. "You were becoming a title," she said. "I would not permit it." He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, "No. I don't suppose you would." He looked down at Cecily, who was watching him with the expression she always had, still and present and very much there. "Come and see the Lower East Field," he said, "the drainage revision." "We are standing in the sitting room," she said. "I know," he said. "The field will wait, but I want to show you the part of the estate where a woman I had not yet met left a note in a catalogue that sent me back to a ledger I had not read in 7 years, and where I intend to put in a new drainage channel in the spring based on the correction she found, because she was right." A pause. "And I want to show it to you as the person who will help me decide where it goes." She looked at him. Something very quiet moved across her face. "I told you the 4th Duke had corrected the method in 1799, she said. "Yes," he said. "You said I was right." "You were right," he said. "The drainage channel was my grandmother's suggestion," she said, with a perfect and slight composure, "not mine." "Then I'll thank her," he said, "and tell her I need you to help me decide where it goes, because I do." She looked at him for another moment and then said very quietly, "All right," and went with him. The marriage was in April. The village church, which was small and old, had a window on the east side that let in the morning light at an angle that turned the stone floor to gold. Adrian had been clear that there was to be nothing elaborate, no London season announcement, no great guest lists, no performance, and Cecily had agreed with a promptness that suggested she had been forming the same view independently. The house party afterward was small. My grandmother, myself, Mr. Vane, mild and more bewildered than ever, and deeply moved, and trying hard not to show any of it, and the neighbors who had known the Ashburns long enough to know what this meant. I stood at Adrian's side at the altar and watched Cecily come down the aisle. She was in a pale gown, simply made, with a small spray of white flowers from the kitchen garden that my grandmother had pressed into her hands that morning. She walked at a steady pace without performance, on her father's arm, looking directly at Adrian. He was watching her from the moment she appeared in the doorway, not as a man watches a ceremony. As a man watches the one thing in the room he intends to keep watching for the rest of his life. When she reached him and her father stepped aside, Adrian took her hand, not the formal movement of a ceremony but an actual taking hold, fingers closing over hers, and he did not let go of it until the vicar, very gently, indicated that the moment in the service had arrived that required other things. The vicar, who was 80 years old and had known our family for 50 of them, conducted the whole of the service with the expression of a man who has married many couples and recognizes the kind that is different. I came back to Blackmere that evening, after the guests had gone home and the house had gone quiet in the way it only goes quiet when it has settled into itself rather than waiting. I found my grandmother in the green sitting room, the one where she had told me about Miss Cecily Vane of Vane Hall 6 months ago, with her teacup and her plans and her accurate assessment of probabilities. She was looking at the fire. I sat across from her and we did not speak for a while. From somewhere in the house, the library, I thought, there were voices, low, unhurried, with no agenda. Adrian's voice and Cecily's, in the rhythm of two people who have been talking all day and are still not finished. "You were right," I said. "I usually am," said my grandmother. "About the assembly, about Cecily, about all of it." She looked at the fire. "I was right about Cecily," she said. "The rest I did not know. I assessed the likelihood and I acted on the assessment, and the rest was theirs." The voices from the library. His low and even. Hers a note lighter, and then something that was, even through the walls and the corridor and the distance, clearly a real laugh. My grandmother heard it. Something in her face changed, the composure held, but behind it was something that had been waiting a long time to be allowed. Relief, perhaps. Or the particular feeling of someone who has done a thing they were not certain would work and found that it has worked, and who is only now, with all the evidence assembled, allowing themselves to have been afraid. "He was becoming someone I didn't recognize," she said again quietly. "Not an unkind person, not even an unhappy one particularly, but," she looked at the fire. "Gone. He was going further away every year and calling it management, and I was watching it happen." "And now," I said. She listened to the voices from the library for a moment. "Now," she said, "he is in the library arguing about something I cannot hear, with a woman who will correct him when he is wrong and agree with him when he is right and know the difference. And he is 31 years old, and that is the whole of what I wanted." I said, "He asked you, on the day of their engagement, whether you had gone to the Aldenvale Assembly deliberately." "Yes," she said. "And you said the roads were better." "And they were," she said, "considerably better than in previous years. The new surface they put down on the Aldenvale Road in the summer made an appreciable difference." I looked at her. She looked back at me with perfect composure. "Grandmother," I said, "did you plan any of it from the assembly?" She was quiet for a moment. The fire moved. "I planned to find out whether she was the sort of person I thought she was," she said. "I found that she was. I arranged for her to be here. The library, that was hers. The catalog note, hers. The study, the breakfast table, the evenings with the letters, the arguments about maps, theirs. The drainage channel will be theirs." She looked at the fire. "I opened a door," she said. "They walked through it." I thought about this. "He asked her to marry him without any audience," I said. "No society, no performance, just the two of them in the library." "Yes," said my grandmother. "You didn't engineer that?" "No," she said, "I didn't need to." A pause. "He had been choosing her for 8 months, Edmund." In every small way a person chooses, the library, the rebuttal notes, the walk by the home farm, the drainage question, the early post in November. By March he had been choosing her for long enough that he knew exactly what he was doing and why, and he needed only to say it. The voices from the library had stilled, not ended. They would not end for another hour, I suspected, but reached the kind of quiet that doesn't require words. My grandmother rose, and I rose with her, and she said, "Go to bed, Edmund. You have been passing through for 6 months, and you are very tired." I said, "I have nowhere to be as it happens." "I know," she said. "You are welcome to remain as long as you like. The East Wing has a very comfortable room with recently replastered walls." She went upstairs. I sat by the fire a little longer and listened to Blackmere Park settle into itself around me. The same house I had grown up in, the same rooms and corridors, and the library on the west side where my brother and I had spent our boyhood in the shelves, where he had catalogued the Aldenmere letters at 19 with the seriousness of a young man who knows what he will one day be. He was that man still, the Duke of Blackmere, with all that meant. The estate, the title, the responsibility, the weight of it. But also tonight and tomorrow, and the spring when the drainage channel would go in where the fourth Duke's correction had put it right, simply Adrian, in the library, with the woman who had looked back at my grandmother across a country assembly room, and then returned to her program, and who had looked back at him in the same way from the moment she arrived, with the same directness she brought to everything she found worth looking at. He had been falling in love with her since the catalog note. He had been choosing her since November. He had not known that October Saturday, when she stepped out of the carriage and looked up at Blackmere Park with her assessing expression, that any of it was going to happen. My grandmother had known, in the way that she knew things, not with certainty, but with the accurate assessment of a woman who has been watching people for 60 years, and knows the difference between what they perform and what they are. She had looked across a country assembly room at a young woman who looked back without flinching, and she had gone home and written me a letter. "I have found someone interesting," she had said. She had been, as usual, exactly right.